tape parades, hugs, and banner headlines greeted August 1945. On the deck of the battleship Missouri, General Douglas MacArthur accepted the Japanese unconditional surrender. The war was over. The World War was over. Time now for a little self-absorption. Time now for the selfishness that war doesn't permit. America had done her duty, had waited patiently for the victory. With the peace came a refocusing of the engine of democracy.
All the mamas wanted their boys to come home. So the greatest army that we ever had, how many million men, sent everybody home. They just took a great army and just literally tore it apart.
Among those returning boys, Savannah native and Benedictine graduate Jack McLaughlin. McLaughlin was a Marine whose service in the Pacific Theater had earned him the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Unlike many others, McLaughlin would stay a Marine, and within the next 5 years, he would in fact define the word Marine for the generation that followed. The baby boom swelled the nation's population and occupied the nation's interest, while cars, refrigerators, and stockings became the new national passion. The American economy exploded, leaving the terrible cost of war as a dim and fading memory.
We had almost 16 million men, under arms. And then they come back home and we're cut down to hardly 1 million men.
Soldiering in those days consisted of occupying the defeated powers of Germany and Japan. Tough duty it was not.
It was great duty. I mean, for an 18-year-old with young, attractive Japanese women around, they were at about 2/3 strength. In other words, instead of having 3 companies in a battalion, 3 rifle companies, they only had 2. The guys weren't physically fit. They didn't do a heck of a lot of training. They did ceremonial things there. They were not prepared to go to war.
But brush fires continually flared along the border of Korea, where the communist North and the American-supported South skirmished over the land and control. The Korean Peninsula was strategic, sharing a border with communist China to the north, but just across the Korean Strait from Japan.
It was a balance of power kind of thing, in that we, the United States, as was Britain, unwilling to see an unfriendly power dominate the Korean Peninsula, which you look at it on a map, it's like an unsheathed dagger, staring right at, pointed right at Japan.
On June the 25th, 1950, the North Koreans turned the brush fires into a worldwide blaze when they screamed across the 38th parallel and ripped through the South. For the Americans, it was a wake-up call, reminiscent of Pearl Harbor, the beginning of a new chapter in American freedom fighting as Savannah remembers the Korean War. At the end of World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, with the communists dominating the north and democratic forces leading the south. From the beginning, there was antagonism between the two, an antagonism that exploded 50 years ago.
North Koreans poured into South Korea in large numbers, swept aside all opposition.
We didn't have any troops in Korea, when the thing started. On the 25th of June, 1950, North Korea attacked across the 38th parallel and just overran the South Korean army.
President Truman made another one of his great decisions. Didn't go to the UN, didn't go to the Organization of American States, didn't go to anybody. He ordered MacArthur to send troops. MacArthur was the supreme commander. Send troops to Korea.
And so began American involvement in Korea, just 5 days after the communists' attack. But already our men were at a disastrous disadvantage. The capital of South Korea at Seoul had fallen the day before America joined the war. President Truman ordered the 24th Infantry out of occupation duty in Japan and into the war in Korea. They, the 24th, would be the first to fight.
Their orders were move north and slow the enemy down, trade space for time. Well, this is, we're talking 600, 700 guys. Not well trained, not well equipped. And they dug in and on a hill, and they looked out, and here came the North Korean army coming down the traditional route to get to Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. Well, they took them in the fire, and they did trade space for time. They took tremendous casualties, a lot of heroism. Our rocket launchers in those days were 2.36-inch rocket launchers. Fired it off your shoulder. They fired it at the North Korean tanks, and they bounced off. That's how bad we were.
The poorly prepared Americans suffered along with the South Koreans as the Communist North threatened to take complete control of the peninsula. The U.S. and South Korean forces fighting under the United Nations banner stopped the Communist blitzkrieg at Busan and kept a beachhead on the Korean peninsula from which to fight back.
U.S. air got involved right away. As a matter of fact, it was U.S. air power that stemmed the tide and helped them stabilize the Busan perimeter. Had we not been able to use our air forces under the 5th Air Force Command in Japan, the story might have been quite different.
The stand at Busan was critical because it exposed the communist lines.
The North Korean supply line was stretched very, very thin. Walker was killed, General Walker was killed in a Jeep accident, and a Lieutenant General by the name of Matthew Ridgway, he was a World War II paratrooper, was given command of the 8th Army. And he looked around for a while and he said, this is a defeatist attitude we got here. So he wanted to attack.
In July of 1950, the Marine Corps Major, Jack McLaughlin, arrived in Korea, one of the growing number of experienced military brought to bear on the communists. But the attention of the world would be focused on an Army man, General Douglas MacArthur, who had a bold plan to change the fortunes of the war. That story when we return as Savannah remembers the war in Korea. As summer wore on in Korea, the American resolve grew, and the U.S. military began to shake off the cobwebs. Realizing that the length of their supply lines exposed the communists, General MacArthur devised a bold strategy to reverse the war's tide. Though greeted with skepticism by American leadership, the plan proved to be a masterstroke.
MacArthur made his famous Incheon landing with the 7th Division and 1st Marine Division to cut off the North Koreans as Ridgway's force pushed forward, called Operation Killer, and that's all they were doing was killing North Koreans.
I landed at Incheon on the day that
Marine Corps Captain George Zettler landed at Incheon in unceremonious style.
we landed in LVTs rented from the Japanese.
Despite the impressive victory, American forces were still playing catch-up.
It was probably 6 or 8 months after I landed in Korea before I ever ate any rations that didn't have at least 1945 stamped on them. As usual, this country, which has a propensity for this thing, were ill prepared. We were still flying World War II vintage airplanes. They were not competitive with the MiGs, and we had limited numbers. So the air commanders there, they had to husband their forces very carefully.
But American resolve overcame the lack of preparation, and the tide clearly turned in favor of the American-led forces. By the fall of 1950, it was hard to imagine the extent of the defeat the communists had inflicted just 4 months prior.
MacArthur split his force, and he had the 8th Army on the west and 10th Corps on the east, moving towards the Yalu River to sweep, really clean up North Korea. And he said, you know, the boys will be home by Christmas. We're going to push them to the sea. Well, the people back in the Pentagon and in the White House, i.e. Harry Truman, were worried about the Chinese coming across. And MacArthur's intelligence said they were not going to come across. Well, of course, they did come across. They came across the Yalu, which was frozen, and they laid in the hills around a place called the Chosin Reservoir.
The Chinese were supporting the North Koreans. They had 300,000 men sitting there waiting, you know. And we go up there and get our 7th Infantry Division and the Marines, 1st Marine Division, virtually annihilated, you know.
In the middle of the drive toward the 38th parallel in the Yalu River were Savannah's Marines and Marine Reserves. Dog Company they were called, and dog tough is what they turned out to be when the war took another sudden turn.
Most of the 1st Marine Division was moved up, way up north, very near the Yalu River, into a reservoir area, and became surrounded by the Chinese when they first came into the war.
With the Chinese directly involved in the conflict, the Marines were extraordinarily outnumbered, and the Communists spent their human capital without concern or remorse.
They poured huge masses of men into the Chinese, into the Korean Peninsula. They did something that you know, was unheard of for us, and that is to put 300,000 or 400,000 men into a battle with the concept that it doesn't make any difference how many of them died, just so they won the battle.
Chosin Reservoir, it's called, a spot on the map, now red with the blood of American servicemen. Not surprisingly, in the middle of the North Korean misery, the United States Marines found their finest hour.
By this time, the temperature was down to about a -20 during the day.
Marine on a 30 caliber, so the life expectancy was about 2.5 minutes.
The bugles and flares started blasting, and we got overrun by the Chinese.
At about 10 o'clock, we heard a lot of Chinese jabbering.
You could hear them chanting, "The Marines, tonight you're going to die. Marines, tonight you die."
Then we heard some foot stomping.
You hear the whistles, and then you get quiet, and you know they're coming after you, and they do.
You never see so many Chinamen in your life. They were like fire ants coming up that hill.
Our division was at one time advised by a higher command to simply abandon its equipment and wounded, and for whatever people that could to try to make it out individually, and just disband as a fighting force.
And we was actually trapped up there for a good while, so we had fought our way out of there.
We're not leaving anything here. We'll either come out as a fighting force or we won't come out.
The Marines and the Army who were up there at the Chosin Reservoir wiped 3 or 4 Chinese divisions off the rolls. They took all their equipment out, they took all their wounded out, they took all their dead out, and you're talking about -30 degrees weather, in snow up to your hips. They had 11 Medal of Honors in that operation, 6 of them posthumous. But it was one of probably the most heroic things that Americans, infantrymen particularly, have ever done.
Jack McLaughlin was taken prisoner at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. He described it as the most difficult time of his life. Let the record show that he was equal to the task.
The Chinese offered to let them surrender, and there was big negotiation discussions with them. And there's several more rounds ensued between McLaughlin and the Chinese political officer, during which McLaughlin averred, quote, "We are not surrendering because you beat us. We are surrendering to get our wounded cared for. If we can't get our wounded evacuated, we will fight on."
McLaughlin spent almost 3 years in the communist prison camp, 3 years enduring beatings, indoctrination, and disease. His weight went from 185 pounds to 119, but he never broke, never gave up, never gave in. When the ceasefire was signed, McLaughlin was freed in a prisoner exchange. Everything he owned is in this bag. But he persevered, regained his strength, and went on to fight again in Vietnam and rise to the level of Lieutenant General. More importantly, he has distinguished himself and this community all of his 81 years, but never more so than while protecting his men and carrying our flag at Chosin Reservoir. An unforgettable moment as Savannah remembers the war in Korea. MacArthur's adventure north of the 38th parallel cost him command of the U.S. forces. President Truman relieved the old soldier of his command and created a firestorm at home that may have cost him the presidency. Meanwhile, in Korea, a new kind of war emerged in the post-MacArthur days that undermined the goals of the American military.
Got orders from General Marshall in Washington and others that you couldn't do it. You can't bomb those bridges.
You could fly along the border from my friends who flew in that conflict and see the MiG airfields just lined with MiGs, and they had a sanctuary.
And all of a sudden we were hit with a howitzer barrage.
Colonel Jamie Hendricks arrived in Korea in 1951 after the war had settled into a battle of attrition where casualties constantly mount, but victory is never possible. He learned quickly that this kind of battle had no respect for an officer's bars.
And there this grizzled old sergeant said, "Tell me, Sergeant, how long has it been since you've had an officer here?" He looked at me and scratched his beard and he said, "You'll be the third one this month, sir."
It was during the static war of neither advance nor retreat that over half of the American deaths are incurred. There in the country, known romantically as the land of the morning calm.
I can remember lying all in an ambush position all night long in the snow, 20 below zero. You can't even move, without giving away your position.
Colonel Hendricks survived the Korean ordeal and went on to command the American Green Beret forces in Europe. That was not the case for one member of Savannah's Jones family, who sent 3 young men to Korea, but only 2 came back.
I had 3 brothers over there, really near just about at the same time. One of my brothers was all shot up on the hill across from me. I had no idea he was in the same regiment as I was in. And then my older brother was killed over there.
Matthew Jones assumes his older brother was killed in Korea. Truth is, he's one of the hundreds of Americans missing in action.
We haven't heard anything, nothing on whether he's alive or dead, It's been many years now. I would love to have been able to find that but I have little hope after all this time.
Jones himself was an infantryman in the Deuce 4, an all-black outfit that served in Korea as part of the 24th Infantry. But whether black or white, Jones discovered Korea was the same.
And we were many times pinned down into the swamps, like I mentioned, into the rice paddies, and it just, it was a hectic situation, it really was.
We'll have more as Savannah remembers the war in Korea after this. It ended with a whimper, with a ceasefire signed on July the 27th, 1953, that denied victory to either side and kept American forces in the Pacific Rim even still today. And now it's called the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the glory of the Second World War. perhaps embarrassed by the open agony of Vietnam. But for the people who served, the families who gave, the memories are still crystal.
It was on page 35 of the newspaper. No guarantee, unless your son or husband or brother or somebody was over there, people really didn't give a damn, and they were tired of it. Well, for those of us who were there, it was a war. Guys were still being wounded. Guys were still being killed. And we were, it was still a war.
I don't agree with everything this Tom Brokaw has to say, but I agree with his book. That, I'm an American soldier. Great soldier.
Generals and senior officers, you know, are portrayed as heroes and so forth. And essentially, I guess they are, but to me, the real hero is that guy who left his home and came and walked through the jungles or climbed the hills, or with a rifle in his hands and a foxhole to sleep in if he's lucky. To me, that's the real hero.
50 years ago it began, half a world away, on foreign soil in miserable conditions. The men you have seen tonight were there, and to them our respect and our thanks as Savannah remembers the war in Korea.